there was lots of anticipation about when the new things were coming out, like Spare Rib. There was lots of excitement and energy, and it was invigorating to read that other people were doing stuff as well, and you've got ideas about actions, and you know, and I remember, you know, when they started to put stuff in that wasn't about Britain or America, because obviously there's always been an American influence on these things, and you start to read about what's happening in other countries and how it just felt like, you know, yes, this is a universal experience that women have. The media is just shocking everywhere, you know. So what I picked up on the international front was it's the same. It's not identical because different issues are going to affect women differently. You know, I remember hearing about FGM, you know, probably back in the 80s, certainly in the 90s, and you know, knowing about things like that that were different for some women that, you know, weren't at that time being experienced, and certainly weren't being experienced by white British women, obviously. But you know, so having this growing understanding of the international context as well, that just, and you know, and the so-called socialist countries. So you know, behind the Iron Curtain, so nominally women had equality in terms of educational opportunities, job opportunities, and therefore some financial, not necessarily independence, but you know, some able to earn money of their own. But there were still all these other structures that it seemed, you know, so we were looking at that a lot because we were interested in leftist ideas about feminism. But you'd read these stories and interviews with women in things like Spare Rib and OutWrite of women who would say, well, no, it's, you know, it became very apparent that male violence was still a problem for women, that women weren't holding any of the senior positions in companies or universities or, you know, any of the public institutions. And, you know, were still subject in the home and in the family or household situation mainly to men being in charge and men making decisions, and women, even if they had a bit of money or a job or an education, were still responsible for everything to do with children and the home, you know, leaving men, as we know, with more free time. So there were lots of things that seemed to be universal, whether you lived under a different political structure or in a different part of the world with a different culture. So I learned loads about that. I mean, we did some on my course as well, but I learned more from magazines than from feminist magazines than I could have ever got from the news, for instance. I mean, the news gives you a picture, but you know, when you start to see it through a feminist lens, you understand what's, you know, you see it differently. So you're not just accepting what they say, but you're seeing underneath that and around it. And that came from the magazines more. So yeah, magazines and books and films and stuff, amazing source of information that shaped, you know, how I thought about the world and what I wanted to do about it. I wrote a letter to Spare Rib. I might have subscribed to Spare Rib at some point because it wasn't that easy to get hold of and I wanted it every month. So I might have been a subscriber, but I can't be sure of that because I didn't have a lot of money. I certainly subscribed to other things because there's no way I could have got them without subscribing to them, because a lot of them were produced in London and they weren't, you know, freely available. You couldn't, like, it wasn't that easy to find things like, I mean, you could get it here. I'm not saying, you know, it wasn't like not available, but it wasn't as straightforward as, you know, buying the Evening Chronicle, for instance, you know, which you could buy from a stand in Northumberland Street in those days. So I might have subscribed, but the letter is very interesting because it's the date is very interesting to me, as well as the content, because it says August 83, because it made me think about who I was in August 83. So I certainly used to tear bits out of them if I was going somewhere else, so that I would know where there was a women's centre or where there was a bar that I could go to when I was going to a conference or visiting another town. So I used them actively in that way rather than just reading them. I don't remember doing anything like dating through a magazine or joining a group through a magazine, because I was involved with lots of things up here, and I was involved in setting things up here and getting involved with existing projects. So I was involved in lots of things, and so I didn't need magazines to get me involved in things. And part of when I worked on the line, which was a phone line, a lot of the calls we got group was people who were looking for other lesbians or lesbian and gay groups that were about their particular thing. So they'd taken information from magazines about new organizations, or where there wasn't a local thing, we would definitely have referred people to a national phone line or a national, in those days, PO box number for a group that you could write to anonymously via a PO box, because everyone would have used information from the magazines and Wire's newsletter and things like that. Or people would phone up asking about events, or, you know, they were visiting Newcastle, where could they go out? So we would hold information about all those things, not just for the phone line, but other organizations I was involved with, you know, like the Young Lesbian Project. You know, they'd want to, you know, go to things, and, you know, so you'd have to have that information. You'd have to keep up to date, and you might be able to do that in your own town, but if people were phoning you from another place, you'd have to be able to look it up, you know. So I mean, I've always been a collector of bits of information, so, you know, we would keep this file of things, and some of that would come from magazines and newsletters, because otherwise how are you going to know? But, you know, things like the bookshops, like Sister Right in London, you know, you would only know about that through the magazine, because I didn't live in London, you know. So I used to, you know, when I went to London, I would have these things with me that I would, you know, make sure that I had the address so, and my A to Z, because that's how you found things in those days, you know, so that I could go and visit these bookshops. So magazines were that kind of bridge for me, and I guess for other people. If you're going to a different town and you want to find a feminist community, it could fulfill that function as well. Now I was discovering lesbian feminism, and then you move into a whole other world of magazines and newsletters, because there was an explosion in the 90s of lesbian stuff. So that was produced in London, and they're completely feminist, these magazines. Shebang maybe a bit less so, a bit more mixed, quite arty and cultural. This is feminist throughout. It's all about health services. This was a specific lesbian health newsletter, and so then in the 80s, it's much more of a it becomes more of a lesbian story. And then in the 90s, very definitely, I was, you know, involved in lesbian projects. I was involved in lesbian and gay activism, as it was then. I know people use different words now, but that's what it was then. It was lesbian and gay. And so these kind of magazines and newsletters were very affirming, you know, that there are other people who are thinking similar things to you, are thinking about it, or doing something about it. They're producing this material, and they're speaking to you about who you are and aspects of your life, and they're showing you people who have some similarity with you, but have different kinds of lives as well, and different problems and different issues to deal with. Yeah, it was yeah, amazing to get this stuff. So I had this kind of flow of literature coming from other places and other sources,